She was warned never to make the king laugh. Nobody warned her about his mother. For 300 years, no servant had lasted more than a season in Revel Castle without learning the same lesson. The king did not raise his voice, did not raise his hand, did not need to. A look was enough. A silence was enough. Every soul who worked beneath that roof moved like they were being watched, because they were. Mira Bellamy did not know any of this the night she walked into the royal kitchen carrying a sack of vegetables and a stubbornness nobody had bothered to warn the castle about. The kitchen was the only room in the fortress that still smelled like something other than stone and old magic. Copper pots hung from iron hooks along the walls, catching the candlelight in warm, moving flashes. Bundles of drying herbs swayed faintly near the hearth. Beyond the enormous arched windows, the towers of Revel rose black against a bruised evening sky. The same view Lady Elowen Revel had stared at, unmoving, for the better part of a year. At 482 years old, Elowen had outlived husbands, wars, and every physician's patience. She had also stopped, quietly and without announcement, wanting to be alive for any of it. The staff had learned not to ask why her meals returned untouched. Her son had stopped asking altogether. He simply sent more physicians, as if grief were a fever that could be treated with enough gold. Mira knew none of this when she knocked on the servant's door with a covered pot and a letter of recommendation nobody had actually verified. She was 29. Human. No title. No magic. Nothing that should have mattered inside a kingdom built on bloodlines and fear. What she had instead was a stubborn refusal to let lonely people disappear quietly. A lesson she'd learned too young, the night her own mother stopped breathing and the house had gone unbearably silent afterward. Mira had promised herself then that she would never again let silence win a room she was standing in. She expected a difficult employer. Every servant she'd spoken to on the road here had said the same thing. The old woman doesn't eat, doesn't speak, doesn't want visitors. What Mira found instead was an elderly woman who had simply given up on being asked to stay. She didn't try to manage Elowen's illness. She made her the stew Elowen remembered from before she was ever a queen. Rustic, humble, nothing a royal kitchen would normally serve, and sat beside her through the long, heavy silences instead of filling them. It took 3 spoonfuls before Elowen spoke at all. "Your food tastes like someone wanted me to stay." Mira didn't answer. She just refilled the bowl, 2 rooms away. King Alaric Vane heard his mother laugh for the first time in longer than he could admit to himself. He was 531 years old, feared across every vampire court on the continent, a man who had never once needed to raise his voice because his silence did the work for him. Armies had surrendered at the sound of his name. His own council flinched when he entered a room. He did not know how to make his mother smile. He stood in the kitchen doorway instead of walking in. The way he had learned to stand outside every room that held something he was afraid to want. Tall, pale, dressed in black and deep burgundy, utterly still, watching his mother laugh at something a stranger had said. Mira saw him first. She didn't bow. She didn't flinch. She looked at the tall, impossibly composed king of Revel, a man whose name alone had ended 3 wars without a single blade drawn, and said the one thing no one in 5 centuries had thought to say to him. "If you're going to stare, Your Majesty, you can at least set the table." For a moment, the most feared man in the kingdom simply blinked. Elowen's laughter cracked louder across the kitchen, delighted, disbelieving, and then, to his own visible confusion, Alaric picked up the plates. He set them down without a word, without meeting Mira's eyes, and left the kitchen as quietly as he'd entered it. But something had shifted in the room, and everyone in it, Elowen most of all, knew it. Mira didn't understand yet what she'd just walked into. She hadn't come to the castle chasing destiny. She'd come because she needed work, because a small village on the border of Revel didn't pay well for cooking, and elderly clients in the kingdom's outer estates paid better, even the ones nobody else wanted to take. Elowen had refused every servant sent to her in the last 2 years. She dismissed physicians. She rejected the blood treatments that had kept her alive for centuries. The kingdom believed the old queen mother was simply dying, the way even immortals eventually did. Mira realized within the first hour that Elowen wasn't dying of anything the physicians could name. She had stopped wanting to live. That night, long after the castle had gone dark and quiet, Mira heard footsteps outside the kitchen door. She opened it to find the king standing there, saying nothing, The way he apparently said nothing about most things that mattered to him. "Did you need something?" she asked. His eyes moved past her to the empty bowl still sitting on the table, scraped clean for the first time in weeks. "She ate more tonight," he said finally, "than she has in 3 weeks. Then he turned and walked back into the dark of the corridor, leaving Mira standing in the doorway, unsure what exactly had just happened. She didn't yet realize the Silent King had just started watching her. She had no idea how much that would cost either of them. Before we go back into that kitchen, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes. And tell me in the comments, have you ever shown kindness to someone everyone else had forgotten about? I want to hear your story. Also, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city below. I read every comment. Now, back to Revel. 3 days became a week. The week folded quietly into a routine nobody had planned, but everybody seemed to need. Every morning, Mira woke before the castle did, moving through the kitchen while the corridors were still dark, and the only sound was the hiss of the hearth catching. Every afternoon, she carried a tray up to Elowen's chambers and sat with her through the long golden hours when the light slanted low across the mountains. Every evening, they ate together at the small table by the window, and the empty castle around them grew a little less empty each time. Elowen began to talk. Not the careful, measured sentences of a queen mother reciting her own history for a stranger. Real talk, the kind that spilled out sideways when someone finally felt safe enough to stop guarding it. She told Mira about riding horses through the Revel Mountains before her hair had turned the color of frost, about a summer she'd spent teaching herself to fence, because no one would teach a girl properly, about the afternoon she'd challenged Alaric's father to a sword duel in front of the entire court and very nearly won. "He let you win," Mira guessed, peeling a bowl of chestnuts. "He absolutely did not," Elowen said, offended. "I disarmed him fairly. He simply told that story differently for the next 400 years. Mira laughed, and Elowen's face did something soft and pleased, like she'd forgotten what it felt like to make someone laugh on purpose. It was during one of these afternoons that Elowen first mentioned Alaric as a boy, and Mira nearly dropped the spoon she was holding. "He hid under the dining table once," Elowen said entirely too casually, "for an entire royal lesson. His tutor searched the castle for 2 hours. Alaric sat there in complete silence the whole time, apparently very committed to his strategy. The king," Mira said slowly, "teed under a table. He was 7. He hated his etiquette tutor with the passion of a man twice his age." Elowen's eyes glinted. "He was always serious in public, even then, terrifyingly composed for a child. But at home," she waved a frail hand, "at home he was impossible. Loud, dramatic. He once cried for a full day, because I wouldn't let him keep a wolf pup he found in the eastern woods." Mira tried and failed to picture the tall, silent man from the doorway as a boy sobbing over a wolf pup. It didn't fit, and yet something about the way Elowen said it, fond, certain, entirely unsurprised, made Mira believe every word. She started noticing him differently after that. Alaric had begun appearing near the kitchen with a consistency Mira couldn't quite explain. He never stepped inside. He simply materialized in doorways, in the corridor beyond, in the shadow of the archway that led toward the dining hall, always present, never participating. At first, Mira assumed he didn't trust her. It made sense. She was human, unranked, alone in a castle full of people who could kill her without effort, and the king had every reason to watch her the way a man watches something he hasn't decided is safe yet. Elowen knew better. "My son," she said one evening, not bothering to lower her voice as Alaric's shadow shifted in the doorway, "has spent 5 centuries terrifying entire armies into surrender. Apparently it took one human cook to finally make him nervous." Alaric said nothing. He turned and walked away, and Mira swore, though she'd never admit it, that his footsteps sounded faster than usual. The knife appeared 2 days later. Mira had cut her finger chopping root vegetables. Nothing serious. Just a careless nick from a blade that had gone dull months ago, and that nobody had thought to replace. She'd wrapped it in a cloth and kept working, mildly annoyed, and thought nothing more of it. The next morning, a new knife sat on the counter where the old one had been. Silver-handled, perfectly balanced, sharper than anything she'd used in years. No note. No explanation. "Elowen," Mira said carefully, holding it up. "Did you do this?" Elowen smiled the particular smile of a woman who knew exactly what had happened, and had no intention of spoiling it. He has always been terrible at saying thank you. Thank you for what? For giving me a reason to eat dinner, Elowen said simply, and went back to her tea. Mira turned the knife over in her hands, and something in her chest shifted in a way she didn't examine too closely. That night, over the last of the soup, Elowen asked her, gently, the way people ask questions they already suspect the answer to, why a woman with no royal ties had spent her life caring for people who weren't hers to care for. Mira told her about her mother, who had died when Mira was too young to understand what dying meant, about the way her mother used to cook whenever Mira was frightened, not because they needed the food, but because the act of cooking meant someone was staying close, meant the house still had a rhythm to it even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I don't know how to comfort people with words, Mira admitted. I only know how to stay in the room and make something warm. Elowen reached over and covered Mira's hand with her own frail one and said nothing at all because for once nothing needed to be said. Alaric, unseen in the corridor, heard every word. He had noticed things about Mira over the past week that he couldn't quite categorize. The way she hummed under her breath while cooking, unaware she was doing it. The way she laughed with his mother, loud and unguarded, as if she'd forgotten the king lived in the castle at all. The way she never lowered her eyes when he entered her room, the way every other servant did, the way even his council did. She spoke to him plainly, without flattery, without fear. He didn't understand the feeling that had settled somewhere beneath his ribs. He was 31 years old. He had not felt ordinary attraction in longer than he could accurately remember, and he was fairly certain this, whatever it was, did not qualify as ordinary. Past midnight, unable to settle, he found himself in the kitchen again, not in the doorway this time. Inside it, Mira looked up from the counter startled. Did you need something? I couldn't sleep. Vampires sleep? He paused, considering the question with more seriousness than it deserved. Some of us do. Mira smiled, small, genuine, unguarded, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Revel, the silent king almost smiled back. Mira started noticing the pattern a few days later. Small, easy to miss if she hadn't already learned to read the old woman's silences the way she once read her mother's. Elin would be mid-story, laughing about some memory from 100 years past, and then, without warning, the light would go out of her. Not dramatically, just a quiet dimming. Like a candle catching a draft, she'd trail off, look toward the window, and say something like, "That was a long time ago now," in a voice that closed the subject entirely. It happened most whenever she mentioned Alaric. One afternoon, stitching a loose thread on her sleeve with hands that shook more than she liked to admit, Elowen finally said it plainly. "I don't want another physician, Mira." She didn't look up. "I've had enough physicians to fill a graveyard twice over. I don't want another century either. Revel has had plenty of me." Mira set down the tray she was carrying and sat, waiting. "I want one dinner," Elowen said. "One. Not as his mother the queen, not as a patient he's obligated to visit. Just dinner. No crown between us. No servants hovering. No reports on my condition." Her eyes finally lifted, and there was something raw in them Mira hadn't seen before. "I raised a boy who used to steal bread from his father's plate and laugh about it for a week. I would like to see him again. Just once, before I stop being able to." Mira didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she stood, quietly, and began planning. She spent the next 2 days recreating dishes Elowen described from memory, a rustic bread that needed no royal kitchen to make it right, a roasted root vegetable stew Elowen swore Alaric's father used to sneak spoonfuls of before it finished cooking, a honey cake that Elowen said Alaric had once eaten an entire tray of and blamed on the dog. That evening, Mira set a small table in the corner of the kitchen. Away from the grand dining hall, Elowen said made everyone feel like they were being watched. 2 plates, 2 cups, 1 candle, because Elowen said too much light made things feel formal, and formal was exactly what she didn't want. Then Mira sent word through a servant that the Queen Mother wished to see the king. Alaric arrived expecting a physician's summary. He found his mother sitting at a small, candlelit table, a chair pulled out across from her and no one else in the room. He stopped in the doorway. For a moment, Mira, watching from the shadow of the pantry, thought he might actually leave. "Please," Alaric Elowen said, quiet and unguarded in a way Mira had never heard her speak to him. He stayed. He sat rigidly at first, the way a man sits in a chair he doesn't trust. His eyes moved over the food, like he was cataloging a threat, rather than a meal. But Elowen didn't ask him anything difficult. She simply talked about the honey cake, about the summer his father had tried to teach him to fish and fallen into the river twice, about the way Alaric used to hum off-key while helping knead bread as a boy, utterly unaware he was doing it. Mira, retreating quietly toward the hallway to give them privacy, heard the exact moment something in the king loosened. He laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long, but it was real, and it carried down the corridor and found Mira standing there, with her hand pressed briefly to her chest, startled by how much that sound moved her. She was still in the kitchen an hour later, wiping down the counters, when Alaric appeared in the doorway again, this time without the careful distance he usually kept. "Thank you," he said. Mira didn't look up right away. "You don't have to thank me. She's your mother." "That's exactly why I should." Something in his voice made her stop what she was doing. She turned to find him standing very still, his composure cracked open just slightly, just enough to see through. "I gave her everything I thought she needed," he said. "Physicians, guards, every comfort money could arrange. I told myself that was love." He paused. "It took a stranger 3 weeks to give her the one thing I never did." Mira didn't correct him. She understood in that moment that this was the closest thing to guilt he'd ever spoken aloud, and that interrupting it would only send him back behind the wall he built so carefully. "My mother used to cook whenever I was scared," she said instead quietly. "I didn't understand until much later that it wasn't really about the food. It was about her staying in the room with me." She met his eyes. "I think your mother just wanted you to stay in the room." Something shifted behind his expression. Recognition, maybe, or grief he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. "What happened to her?" he asked. "Your mother. She got sick when I was young. There wasn't enough time to prepare for it, even though we knew it was coming." Mira's throat tightened unexpectedly. "I still cook her recipes. I think some part of me believes if I keep making them, she isn't entirely gone." Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "My father died protecting this kingdom," he said finally. "I promised him at the end that I would never let it fall. I think I forgot that a kingdom isn't the only thing worth protecting." Mira's eyes had gone bright without her permission. She looked away, embarrassed, but not quickly enough. Alaric had already seen it, and something in his face said he understood exactly what that look cost her to let show. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happens between two people who have both, separately, learned what it costs to lose someone and pretend they haven't. Eventually, Alaric moved toward the door. He stopped beside her, closer than he usually allowed himself to stand, and reached toward her hand resting on the counter. He stopped just before touching it. Mira noticed. She didn't move away. Neither of them said anything about it. "Good night, Mira," he said finally. It was the first time he had ever used her name. After that night, something in the castle shifted, quietly and without anyone announcing it. Alaric began finding reasons to be in the kitchen. He never called them reasons. He simply appeared. After council meetings, before dinner, sometimes for no occasion Mira could identify at all, and stood near enough to matter, far enough to pretend he hadn't meant to come. He started eating what she made, sueshum, not out of obligation, not to please his mother, but because Mira had left a plate out one evening and he'd eaten it standing at the counter, like a man who'd forgotten food could taste like something other than duty. Then, one evening, he picked up a knife. "I can help," he said, in the tone of a man announcing a military campaign. Mira eyed him. "With vegetables. I have led armies. Leading armies and dicing an onion are different skill sets, Your Majesty." He gave her a look that might have been offended, might have been amused, and picked up a carrot with the grim determination of a man who had never once in 5 centuries been told no. His first cut was uneven. His second nearly took off a finger. By the 4th, Mira was laughing so hard she had to set down her own knife. "I've killed men more efficiently than this," he muttered, glaring at the mutilated carrot. "Vegetables are clearly your greatest enemy," Mira said, wiping her eyes. "The court should know. It would improve their morale considerably." He almost smiled, that small, reluctant curve he only ever gave her, and reached for another carrot with slightly more caution. Alaric was not a man of declarations. Mira understood that quickly. He didn't speak affection. He built it, quietly, in the shape of things he fixed without being asked. The kitchen grew warmer within a week. A new stalk of firewood appeared without explanation, and the drafty window near the pantry stopped rattling. Her favorite paring knife, worn soft at the handle, was replaced with one that fit her grip exactly, though she'd never mentioned the old one bothered her. After late dinners, he began walking her to her chambers, saying almost nothing the entire way, simply present, simply there, like a habit neither of them had agreed to. But both of them kept. Mira, in turn, began leaving food for him, small things, a wrapped pastry near his study, a cup of something warm outside the council hall when meetings ran long. Neither of them spoke about it. It became its own quiet language, built entirely out of things left behind for the other to find. Elowen noticed everything and made no attempt to hide that she was delighted. She sent Mira to the herb garden and, within minutes, sent Alaric after her to make sure the girl didn't get lost. Despite Mira having walked that garden a dozen times unaccompanied, she asked Alaric to carry supplies Mira could easily carry herself. Twice, mid-conversation, she closed her eyes and feigned sleep so convincingly that Mira and Alaric were left staring at each other across the room with nothing to do but talk. "She is doing this on purpose," Alaric said once, watching his mother's very obviously fake slumber. "I would never accuse the Queen Mother of scheming," Mira said solemnly. "You are terrible at lying. I learned from the best. The storm came, without warning, the way mountain storms did." Thunder cracked over Revel hard enough to rattle the windows, and somewhere deep in the castle's ancient wiring, the lights failed entirely, plunging the kitchen into darkness broken only by a single candle. Mira managed to light with shaking hands. Alaric appeared in the doorway moments later, checking on her the way he always did now without needing to be asked. "The whole castle's out," Mira said. "I don't think it's coming back tonight." He didn't leave. He sat across from her at the small table where his mother had once made him remember how to laugh, and in the candlelight, with nowhere else to be and nothing to hide behind, he began unprompted to talk. He told her about his father's death, not the official account the court knew, the real one, the blood, the silence afterward, the promise he'd made at his father's bedside to protect the kingdom no matter what it cost him. "I became king 3 days later," he said. "There wasn't time to mourn. There was a kingdom that needed a ruler, and I decided the only way to survive it was to become useful enough that grief couldn't catch me." "Did it work?" Mira asked quietly. "No," he admitted. "It just meant I never stopped long enough to notice it hadn't." Mira reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, close enough that he could close the distance if he wanted to. "You can protect people," she said, "and still let them love you. Those aren't opposite things, Alaric. You've just never let anyone test that." Something in his face broke open, quiet and unguarded, like a door he hadn't meant to leave unlocked. He reached for her then, slowly, like a man approaching something he was afraid might vanish if he moved too fast. His hand found her jaw, her breath caught. Their faces drew closer in the candlelight, close enough that she could feel the space between them disappearing. "Alaric!" Elowen's voice cracked down the hallway, startled and urgent. "The candles in my chambers have gone out." They broke apart instantly, the moment shattering like glass. Alaric was on his feet before Mira had fully processed what almost happened, already moving toward the hallway, leaving her alone at the table with her heart pounding and the candle guttering between them. She didn't know, that night, that the storm outside had been the smaller danger. Word had already begun moving through the court, quiet at first, the way rumors always started, then less quiet. The king had been seen in the kitchens too often. The king had walked a human servant to her chambers 3 nights running. The king, who had not shown genuine interest in anyone in 3 centuries, was behaving like a man who had. Lady Seraphine heard all of it and liked none of it. She found Mira 2 days later in the castle's east corridor, elegant and cold in a way that made the air itself feel colder. "You should understand something," Seraphine said, "before you mistake his attention for anything permanent." Mira said nothing, though her stomach tightened. "Humans are lovely," briefly, Seraphine continued, studying her the way one studies something about to spoil. "You are a candle inside a kingdom built for darkness, girl. Candles are charming. Candles are also temporary." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Eventually, the darkness wins. It always does." She walked away before Mira could answer. Mira stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, looking down the hall toward the distant shape of Alaric's study. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Revel, she wondered, quietly, painfully, if Seraphin might be right. The rumors reached Mira before she understood what they were. At first it was only glances, nobles falling silent when she passed, servants who used to greet her now looking away. Then the whispers grew bolder. She was manipulating the Queen Mother, some said, working some quiet human trick to secure her place in the castle. Others claimed she was using her closeness to Elwyn as a ladder to the king himself. The cruelest version, the one that made Mira's stomach turn when she finally heard it spoken aloud, was that she was angling for immortality, trading whatever affection she could fake for a bite that would make her something other than temporary. Alaric heard every version. Mira watched it happen to him in real time. The tightening of his jaw, the stillness that came over him before he left a room rather than say something he couldn't take back. He didn't tell her what he was hearing. He didn't need to. She could see it settling into him like a weight he refused to put down. It came to a head at a royal gathering 3 nights later. Mira hadn't wanted to attend. Elwyn had insisted, claiming she needed company at the long table, though Mira suspected it was less about company and more about not leaving her alone with the court's teeth bared. She stood near the edge of the hall in a borrowed gown that felt like a costume, watching nobles in dark silks murmur behind painted fans when one of them decided silence wasn't satisfying enough. Lord Desserine, a broad-shouldered noble with old money and older prejudices, raised his voice just enough to be heard across half the hall. "Tell me," he said, looking directly at Mira, "does the food taste different when you're cooking your way into a crown?" The hall went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet right before something breaks. Alaric's voice, when it came, was not loud. It never was. That was what made it terrifying. "You will apologize," he said. Desserine, either drunk on wine or his own arrogance, lifted his chin. "I meant no offense to the king, only an observation. You will apologize," Alaric said again, and this time something shifted behind his eyes, a darkness Mira had never seen in him, ancient and absolute, the thing 5 centuries of fear had been built on. The candles along the wall seemed to gutter, though there was no wind. Desserine's face went pale. He apologized within seconds, stammering, bowing so low his knee nearly touched the floor, and the hall exhaled as one. Mira stood frozen, watching the king she'd learned to laugh with become, in an instant, the king the entire continent had learned to fear. It should have frightened her. Instead, walking beside him afterward in silence, she understood something else entirely. He hadn't done it for his pride. He'd done it for her. Elwyn found her later that night, sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing. "You're troubled," Elwyn said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful slowness her body demanded now. "I don't understand him," Mira admitted. "One moment he's terrifying, the next he's—" She stopped, unable to find the word. Elwyn was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its usual teasing lightness. After his father died, Alaric believed it was his failure. He was there, you understand. He watched it happen and told himself over and over that if he had been faster, stronger, more powerful, his father would still be alive. She looked toward the window, toward the dark shape of the mountains. So he decided he would never again allow himself to be in a position where losing someone could break him. He built walls. He stopped needing people. Even me. Even you. He visits me only when duty demands it, or when you're there to soften the visit into something bearable, Elwyn said gently. He thinks loving someone gives fate a weapon against him, Mira. That's what his silence is. It was never emptiness. She reached over, taking Mira's hand in her own frail one. It's fear. Mira sat with that for a long time after Elwyn had gone to bed. She found him the next evening, in the corridor outside his study, and before she could stop herself, the question came out. "Why do you only visit her when I'm there?" Alaric's expression closed immediately. "That isn't true." "It is." Mira held his gaze, refusing to soften it. "You built a kingdom where no one can hurt you, Alaric. But you also built one where no one can reach you, not even your own mother." His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might simply walk away, the way he always did when a conversation cut too close. But he didn't move, and the fury in his eyes wasn't at her. She realized, slowly, It was at himself, for how completely she was right. He said nothing. He turned and left instead, and Mira stood alone in the corridor, wondering if she'd finally gone too far. He found her an hour later in the empty kitchen, the candle burned low, the whole castle asleep around them. "When I am near you," he said, without preamble, without his usual careful distance, "I forget what I am supposed to be." Mira's breath caught. "Maybe," she said softly, "you should remember who you were before you became king." Something in him broke open at that, not violently but completely, like a wall giving way after holding for too long. He crossed the space between them and kissed her, slow and restrained at first, as though he were still afraid of what it might cost him. Then something in him surrendered entirely, and the kiss deepened into something neither of them tried to hold back. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Mira understood with sudden, terrifying clarity what she'd been trying not to admit for weeks. She was falling in love with him, and somewhere beyond the kitchen walls and candlelit halls and whispered corridors, the court had already made one thing unmistakably clear. Loving Alaric might cost her everything she had. For the first time since arriving at Revel, Mira began pulling away. It wasn't obvious, not at first. She still cooked, still sat with Elowen through the long afternoons, still moved through the castle with the same quiet purpose she always had. But she stopped lingering in doorways when Alaric passed. She stopped leaving small meals outside his study. When he found her in the kitchen now, she kept her hands busy and her answers short, and she told herself it was for his own good. She had become a weakness. She could feel it in the way the servants watched her, in the silence that followed her through the halls, in the memory of Desserin's face going pale under Alaric's stare. And it wasn't only Alaric she was endangering. If the court turned on her hard enough, she wasn't certain they'd stop at her. Eluin had already spent a lifetime being whispered about for loving too openly. Mira refused to be the reason that whispering turned into something worse. Seraphine found her in the garden 2 days later, moving between the herb beds with the same cold elegance she always carried, like frost that had learned to walk. "You should sit down," Seraphine said, without warmth. "What I'm about to tell you deserves your full attention." Mira didn't sit. "Say it then." Alaric cannot marry a human, not without unraveling 3 centuries of alliances built on bloodline and succession. Seraphine's voice was matter-of-fact, almost gentle, which made it worse. "Several members of the council are already discussing it. They intend to force him to choose. You, or the crown he swore to his dying father he would protect." She tilted her head. "I imagine you can guess which one he'll choose." "I don't believe you," Mira said, though something cold had already settled in her chest. "Then believe your own ears," Seraphine said, and walked away. She didn't mean to overhear the council meeting. She'd only gone looking for Alaric, and the voices carrying through the half-open door of the council chamber stopped her before she could knock. "Hat cannot continue, your majesty," one noble was saying, voice tight with barely restrained anger. "The court will not accept a human at your side. End it, or we will end it for you." There was a silence. Then Alaric's voice, quiet and even. "Her humanity is not a crime. It is a liability," another voice snapped. "One that grows more dangerous the longer you allow it." "If you force my hand," Alaric said, "you will find I do not respond well to threats, even from this council." The room erupted. Voices rising, someone invoking the word rebellion, like a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. Alaric's voice cut through at once, sharp and final, and the room went silent again. Mira stood frozen outside the door, her heart pounding. Seraphine hadn't been lying. And worse, Alaric was standing at the center of a fight he refused to back down from. A fight that existed only because of her. She walked away before anyone could see her there. That night, Elowen grew weak again. Mira recognized the symptoms the moment she entered the chamber. The shallow breathing, the pallor, the way Elowen's hand trembled reaching for the cup. Mira offered. It was the same decline Mira had first found her in, months ago, and it terrified her more now than it had then, because now she understood exactly how fragile the peace around this castle truly was. "You're leaving," Elowen said quietly once Mira had settled beside her. Mira's throat tightened. "I haven't said anything." "You don't have to." Elowen's eyes, tired but sharp as ever, found hers. "I've watched you pull away for days. I know what that means." If I stay, I make things worse for him. For you. Mira's voice cracked despite herself. The council is threatening rebellion, Elowyn. Because of me. Elowyn was quiet for a long moment. Then gently, if you leave, he will pretend he doesn't care. How do you know? Because I raised him, Elowyn said simply. I have watched that boy build walls around every soft thing in his heart since the day his father died. He will let you go, and he will tell himself it never mattered, and he will be lying to both of us for the rest of his very long life. Mira held Elowyn's hand and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't break something, and both of them. She left before dawn. She spent the last hours of the night preparing one final meal. Every dish Elowyn had ever mentioned loving, the honey cake, the rustic bread, the stew that tasted like a childhood, neither of them could get back. She wrote careful instructions for the kitchen staff, tucked them beneath a jar of dried herbs, and packed the small bag of belongings she'd arrived with, feeling absurdly like she was leaving more behind than she'd ever owned. Alaric found her there, in the candlelit kitchen, just past midnight. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Your mother has you again," Mira said, not looking up from her bag. "You don't need me anymore." That isn't true. She finally met his eyes, and something in her chest ached at how lost he looked, standing there in a doorway he'd once been too afraid to fully enter. "Then what am I to you, Alaric?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came. The silence stretched, long and unbearable. 5 centuries of careful restraint rising up exactly when it mattered least. Mira watched him search for the words and failed to find them, and something inside her, some last stubborn hope, finally gave out. "That's what I thought," she said quietly, and picked up her bag. He didn't stop her. He couldn't seem to make his voice work at all. She walked out into the corridor, and then out into the cold hour before dawn, and the castle swallowed the sound of her footsteps until there was nothing left of them at all. Alaric stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after she'd gone. Her chair sat empty at the small table where his mother had once taught him to laugh again. On the counter, forgotten in her hurry, lay the worn wooden spoon she'd used every single day since she'd arrived. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. The small, ordinary thing that had somehow undone 500 years of careful, deliberate solitude. And for the first time in 5 centuries, the Silent King understood with a clarity that arrived far too late, that he had let something precious disappear into the dark simply because he had been too afraid to say what it meant to him. The scream that woke him wasn't a scream at all. It was a servant's frantic knocking, and beneath it, the sound of something breaking in the room down the hall. Alaric reached Elowyn's chambers to find her collapsed near the window, one hand still stretched toward the empty kitchen tray. No one had thought to fill that morning. Her breathing was shallow. Her skin, always pale, had taken on a gray, papery quality he hadn't seen since the worst of her decline, months before Mira had ever knocked on the servant's door. "She's gone," Elowyn whispered, before he could ask. "Isn't she?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He carried his mother down to the kitchen himself, refusing the servants who tried to take her from his arms, because some part of him, some part he didn't examine too closely, needed to see it for himself. He needed to see the room where all of this had started. The chair was empty. The wooden spoon sat exactly where he'd left it the night before, untouched, waiting for a hand that wasn't coming back. He understood then, with a clarity that felt like grief and guilt braided into something unbearable, that Mira had never simply been feeding his mother. She had been giving her a reason to want tomorrow, and in one night, in one act of cowardice dressed up as restraint, he had taken that reason away. He didn't call for the kitchen staff. He didn't send for a physician. He set his mother gently in a chair, pulled the ingredients Mira always used from their shelves with hands that had commanded armies and never once held a paring knife, and tried desperately to remember everything he'd watched her do. He was terrible at it. The vegetables came out uneven, some chunks large enough to choke on, others reduced to paste. He oversalted the broth, then tried to correct it, then oversalted it again. He nearly set the whole pot ablaze when he stepped away for a moment too long, cursing in a language older than the kingdom itself, while smoke curled toward the ceiling. But he didn't stop. An hour later, exhausted, singed at the sleeve, he carried a bowl of something that only vaguely resembled Mira's stew to where his mother lay resting. Eluin opened her eyes at the smell. She looked at the bowl, then at her son. Soot on his jaw, his usually immaculate composure entirely unraveled, and something like laughter moved weakly through her chest. She took one spoonful, grimaced very slightly, took another anyway. "You were always better at ruling," she said, her voice thin but steady, than cooking. Alaric sat beside her, his head bowed, something in him finally breaking under the weight of everything he'd refused to feel for years. "I don't know how to fix this." Eloin reached for his hand with what strength she had left. "Go get her, Mother. Go get her," she said again, firmer this time, her eyes bright despite everything. "I did not survive 5 centuries to watch my son let the one good thing in this castle walk into the dark alone." The old Alaric would have stayed. Duty had always been his answer to fear. Stay, be useful. Let the crown fill a space where feeling should have gone. He had built an entire life on that instinct. He left it behind that morning. He handed his counsel to men he trusted, without waiting for their objections, mounted a horse before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, and rode the road toward the village faster than any king of Revel had ridden in 100 years. He found her an hour later, walking alone, her bag slung over one shoulder, dawn breaking pale and gold across the fields around her. She stopped when she saw him. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "I can't destroy your kingdom, Alaric," she said finally, her voice steady despite everything. "I won't be the reason it falls apart. You are never destroying anything." He dismounted, closing the distance between them, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had finally stopped being afraid of what came next. "I did that myself, years ago, long before you arrived." "I'm human," she said, as if he needed reminding. "I know. I'll grow old. I'll age in front of you while you stay exactly the same." "I know." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "What happens when I die?" He didn't flinch from the question, though it clearly cost him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I have never let myself imagine losing someone I chose to keep, not since my father." He stopped in front of her, close enough now that she could see everything he'd spent 5 centuries hiding, laid bare in the morning light. "I have lived for 500 years without needing anyone, Mira. Then you walked into my mother's kitchen, and somehow, you became the first person I was afraid to lose." Mira felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest, unraveling every wall she'd built over the past week to survive leaving him. He wasn't offering her immortality. He wasn't asking her to become something else, something safer, something the court could accept without complaint. He wasn't commanding her back to the castle the way a king commands a subject. He was standing in front of her, entirely undefended, choosing to be afraid out loud. "Then you should have said something," she said, her voice unsteady, "before I left. I am saying it now." He kissed her, then, gently at first, like a question he already knew the answer to, and Mira answered it by closing the last of the distance between them herself. The kiss deepened, unhurried, certain, the kind of kiss that didn't need to prove anything because everything had already been said. When they finally broke apart, dawn had fully broken across the fields, gold light spilling over both of them like something neither of them had earned. But both of them had finally chosen. Alaric took her hand. Not the way a king takes a servant's hand to lead her somewhere she's required to go, but the way a man reaches for something he refuses to let slip away again. "Will you come home with me?" he asked. Mira looked at him, soot still faintly visible on his jaw, his eyes open in a way she'd never seen them. The silent king finally entirely undone. "Only," she said, a smile breaking through despite everything, "if I don't have to call you your majesty in the kitchen." For the first time since she'd known him, Alaric laughed. Real, unguarded, startled out of him, and the sound carried across the fields like something that had been waiting 500 years to finally be free. They rode back into Revel as the morning fully broke, and word of the king's return traveled faster than the horses did. Mira felt the court's eyes the moment they crossed into the castle grounds, servants pausing mid-task, nobles gathering at windows, the particular hush that fell over a place when everyone already suspected the shape of what was coming. She had expected to slip back in quietly, unnoticed, the way she'd always tried to move through Revel. Alaric had other plans. He walked into the royal hall with her hand in his, in full view of the council, in full view of every noble who had spent the past week deciding her fate without her. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The room went silent the way rooms always did around him. But this time, the silence carried a different weight, shock mostly, and beneath it, the first stirrings of a fight nobody had expected him to bring into the open. "Your Majesty," one councilman began carefully, "we assumed the matter had been settled." Alaric finished for him. "It has been. The human has a name," Alaric said, and his voice, though quiet, cut to the hall like a blade drawn slow enough to be seen coming. "Mira is not a servant to be dismissed at this council's convenience. She is the reason my mother eats again, the reason she laughs again, the reason she wants to see another sunrise, when for the better part of 2 years none of you managed to give her one." His eyes moved across the gathered nobles, unflinching. "I will not have her treated as beneath this court, not by anyone in this room." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Seraphine stepped forward, composed as always, her voice smooth and reasonable in a way that made it more dangerous, not less. "No one questions her kindness, Your Majesty. We question her place. A human cannot understand 5 centuries of tradition. She cannot understand what it means to carry this crown, or what this court requires to endure." All eyes turned to Mira. She didn't look away, and she didn't reach for Alaric's hand for courage, though she was grateful it was still there. "You're right," Mira said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I don't understand your traditions. I've never claimed to." She let that land before continuing. "But I understand loneliness. I understand what it looks like when someone has stopped believing tomorrow is worth waiting for. I understand grief, because I buried my mother young and learned exactly what it costs to carry that alone." She looked toward Elowen, seated at the edge of the hall, watching with quiet pride. "And I understand Elowen, better maybe than anyone in this room who spent centuries calling her Queen Mother without once sitting beside her in the dark." No one answered. No one, for the first time in longer than Mira had been alive, seemed to have anything to say to that at all. Alaric let the silence hold a moment longer before he spoke again. "Mira will have a permanent place at the royal table," he said. "Not as a servant, not as a political arrangement to be negotiated by this council. As my chosen companion." His gaze swept the room once more, daring anyone to object. "That is not a request. It is the way things are now." No one objected. In the weeks that followed, the castle changed in ways too quiet to name all at once, but impossible to miss. Elowen grew stronger. Not fully, not in the way that erased 400 years of a body finally beginning to feel its age, but stronger in the way that mattered most. She still tired easily. She still needed her afternoon rest, still leaned on her cane more than she once had. But she ate every meal now, and she laughed easily. And she had taken up a new hobby that delighted her far more than it delighted her son, critiquing Alaric's wardrobe with the ruthlessness of a woman who had earned the right to say whatever she pleased. "That collar makes you look like you're mourning someone," she told him one evening, entirely unprompted. "I am the king. This is formal attire. It's tragic is what it is." She turned to Mira with a conspiratorial glint. "Tell him. I'm staying out of this one," Mira said, smiling into her tea. The kitchen, too, had become something new. No longer just Mira's domain, but a shared space. Alaric drifted into most evenings, learning, slowly, and with considerable damage to several vegetables, how to cook. He still claimed to dislike the sweeter human desserts Mira made, insisting they were too rich, too indulgent for a man of his discipline. Mira caught him eating an entire slice of honey cake alone in the kitchen past midnight more than once, and said nothing, only left a second slice out the following night, which also disappeared. He never announced his affection. He simply left things. A single flower near her workspace some mornings, a replaced tool before she'd noticed the old one had worn out, his presence beside her at the counter without being asked. And Mira, without quite deciding to, had started setting a second plate at every meal, automatically the way a person sets a place for someone they no longer imagine eating alone. One evening, watching him fumble through chopping herbs with far more focus than the task required, she asked him quietly, "Do you regret it? Choosing me?" He didn't hesitate. I regret every century I spent believing I had to choose between being king and being human. You're not human, she said, half teasing. You know what I mean, he said, and the look he gave her told her he did. Entirely, and that the answer had never once been in doubt. Across the kitchen, Eowyn sat wrapped in her shawl, watching the two of them fall easily into their evening rhythm. Mira laughing at something Alaric had ruined, Alaric pretending not to be pleased by the laughter. The whole room warm with the particular ordinary happiness Eowyn had once believed her son would never let himself have. She smiled quietly to herself and said nothing to interrupt them. Her greatest wish, after everything, after centuries of watching her son build walls thick enough to survive anything except loneliness, had finally come true. He was no longer merely surviving. For the first time in 500 years, her son was living. The kitchen looked almost exactly as it had the night Mira first walked into it. The same copper pots hung from their iron hooks, catching candlelight in the same warm, moving flashes. The same herbs dried above the hearth. Beyond the arched windows, the towers of Revel still rose black against the evening sky. The same view that had once watched over a woman who'd stopped wanting to be alive to see it. Nothing in the room had changed. Everything in it had. 3 places were set at the small table by the window. One for Eowyn, one for Mira, one for Alaric. No empty chair. No plate going cold across from someone eating alone, the way it had for years before Mira ever knocked on the servant's door. For the first time in longer than any of them could easily count, no one in this kitchen was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. Eowyn settled into her seat slowly, her cane resting against the table, and watched Mira stir the pot on the stove with the same quiet contentment she'd worn every evening for months now. I used to think immortality meant having endless time, Eowyn said, almost to herself. That was the whole promise of it, once. More years than anyone could spend. She looked toward the window, toward the mountains she'd stared at for so long, without truly seeing. It took me 400 years to understand that endless time means nothing at all, if you spend it without the people you love beside you. Her eyes found Mira's. You gave me my son back. I don't think I've properly thanked you for that. You don't have to thank me, Mira said softly, echoing words she'd once said to Alaric in this very room. I know, Eowyn said, smiling. That's exactly why I'm going to anyway. Alaric arrived not long after shrugging off his outer coat and settling into the chair beside Mira, rather than across from her. Close enough that his shoulder brushed hers the way it did most evenings now, a habit neither of them commented on anymore. Before you, he said quietly, watching Mira work at the stove, I believed I was protecting everyone. My mother, this kingdom, myself, though I never would have admitted that part. He paused, and Mira glanced over, giving him the space to finish. I understand now that I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting myself from ever having to feel something I couldn't control. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It took me 5 centuries to learn what most people learn by 20. To be fair, Mira said, most people don't have 5 centuries to avoid learning it. He almost smiled at that. Mira reached into the drawer beside the stove and pulled out the worn wooden spoon she'd used the very first night she cooked in this kitchen. The same one she'd left behind on the counter the night she'd walked out before dawn. The one he'd picked up and turned over in his hands, alone understanding too late what he'd let disappear. She handed it to him. Alaric looked at it, then at her, recognition settling slowly across his face. Why are you giving me this? Because you still need practice, Mira said, entirely serious. Your knife work has improved, your seasoning has not. He huffed something close to a laugh and took the spoon anyway, turning it over the way he had that night, except now it wasn't grief in his hands. It was simply his. A small, ordinary thing that had somehow become one of the most important objects in 500 years of his life. They ate together, the 3 of them, the way they had nearly every evening since Alaric had ridden out to bring her home. Eowyn told another story from Alaric's childhood, this one involving a stolen crown of flowers and a very undignified chase through the castle gardens that had ended with the future king of Revel face first in a fountain. That did not happen, Alaric said, with the particular firmness of a man who knew it absolutely had. I have 3 witnesses, Eowyn said serenely. They were bribed. With what? You were 7. Mira laughed so hard she had to set down her fork, and Alaric, watching her, gave up trying to maintain his dignity and let himself laugh too, easy, unguarded. The sound filling the kitchen the way it had that first night. His mother had laughed, and he hadn't known how to join in. He knew how. Now. Later, once Elowyn had retired for the evening and the candle between them had burned low, Mira asked the question that had been sitting quietly in her chest for weeks. "Will it always be difficult?" she asked. "Because I'm human. Will there always be a court trying to push me out? Always be people who think I don't belong?" Alaric didn't lie to her, and she loved him a little more for that. "Yes," he said. "There will always be people who oppose us. There will always be differences between us that don't disappear simply because we've chosen each other. You will grow old, Mira. I won't. That will not stop being true, no matter how much either of us wishes it could." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "But I promise you this," he continued, taking her hand across the table. "I will never again make decisions out of fear of what I might lose. I spent 5 centuries doing exactly that, and it cost me every good thing I might have had. I would rather have you for whatever years were given than live forever protected from ever loving anyone at all." It wasn't a promise of forever. It was something better, a promise to be present for however long forever turned out to be. Later that night, Mira stood at the stove again, stirring the same copper pot from the very first evening, steam curling up past the arched windows toward a sky full of stars. Elowyn sat at the table now, instead of merely watching from a chair pulled close. And Alaric, the king who had once stood frozen in the doorway, too afraid to cross into a room full of warmth he didn't know how to claim, sat right beside Mira, close enough to reach for her without hesitation. Part of the laughter instead of listening to it from the shadows. The image was the same kitchen, the same candlelight, the same view of the mountains beyond the glass. But nothing about it was the same at all. Sometimes love does not arrive with magic, or prophecy, or destiny written across the stars. Sometimes it walks into an old woman's kitchen carrying a wooden spoon, stays long after everyone else has given up and gone, and quietly teaches an immortal king that the greatest danger was never losing someone he loved. It was never letting himself love them at all.